Hey, what's up? Welcome to Side Quest, the fourth panel, where I'm going to get into the behind the scenes, the making of, and fun stories that don't make it into the regular three panels of the comic each week. And so the best way to introduce the show is to jump right in. So the very first comic that brought us back was April 1st. And I'd always intended the comic to come back. I just didn't know it was the way it did come back was completely a shock for me. In November of 2019, it started the 10-year anniversary of the comic and had 5 comics in the barrel ready to go. 4 of them came out. Couldn't keep up with that schedule, so I held one back, which to this recording still hasn't been released for no specific reason or anything. And so I always intended to bring the comic back, and around in February, I sketched a real quick cartoon kind of sketch of Jarv in my sketchbook, and I really liked it. And for years, I was trying to find a different way to kind of draw or produce the comic that wasn't the usual traditional comic book way I was doing before. Not that there is any tradition of, specific way to make comics. You can make comics anyway, but I would make them, draw, ink, scan, color, do everything, that way. And it's the process that I enjoy and, mostly use, but I wanted to find a way for years to do the comic in a parallel to the regular production of the comic, because the regular production of the comic is kind of, it's a tedious process sometimes, you know what I mean? And a lot of times the jokes and what I do in Side Quest is just, there's certain stories that I'm like, Mom, I'm going to go through, the process just to have like this quick joke, you know what I mean? And so I would kind of think that like, hey, maybe some comics can be produced in a simpler way, using Illustrator or something where I can repeat scenes quickly. And after doing it, I realized that there's still a ton of work involved. It's not really, a real shortcut. It's just a different way of kind of producing comics. So what I could do is have the traditional, hand-drawn and then digitally produced comics alongside with this all-digital version of the comic. And for years, I would draw different styles. I even had like a cat version after Cat Quest came out of Jarv and Polly that was like, it was themed after a comic and it would kind of take on its own life. I think originally one of the ideas was like Jarv or Paul was going to fall asleep and then they end up in a video game. So they're like 16-bit or 8-bit sprites. And every idea just kind of like fell flat, wasn't working. And all of a sudden, in February, I sketched this real quick, picture of Jarv, and it hit, and I drew Polly next to it, and then it kind of worked. And I kind of kept that in the back pocket, but it was never intended to come out in April. You know what I mean? It was just like a thing. And so everything with COVID happened. So we started working from home on March 13th, brought everything home. And my artboard, which you can kind of see behind me, was my office for a month. And so I couldn't draw. So I couldn't get the board started. I mean, I could figure it out a way, but I wasn't really in that mind frame. I needed something to do, but I couldn't, do it in the way I used to. So I knew I had this picture of Jarv and Polly and took a picture of it with Adobe Capture on my phone, brought it into Illustrator, and when I had some downtime, after work or whatever, I would just start noodling around. So the month of March, the remainder of the month, I just had all this energy, this nervous energy, this scared energy. I needed to create stuff, pumped into Side Quest. On April 1st, which I thought was fitting to kind of relaunch the comic, after such a long hiatus, because it'd been off for a while before I even brought back, the original for the 10 years, So I had this cool different way of making the characters, and I could move their faces a little bit. And I knew that once I created something, I had it, I had it forever. If I made a face or, I just really liked this idea. And this was what I had been kind of striving for years. And it kind of came out of this weird time of, nervous energy, and I feel like a lot of my friends, creators and stuff like that started podcasts all of a sudden, or, relaunched, web comics or different things. It was like the same idea of just that, like, we're in this weird moment. We need to create something. I have all this, energy. I need an outlet, and that was kind of themed to what that first comic was kind of themed after, the whole idea of, Jarv and Polly are coming together talking about, originally it was 3 weeks or even 2 weeks, that we were going to be in quarantine or shelter in place. And then Jarv kind of runs down everything that they have, video games, comics, movies, Netflix, books, Hulu, Prime, like all this stuff that we have, and the punchline is, have we been training for this day? And it was sort of this a tongue-in-cheek kind of way of saying, like, just look around your house. You have things to do for these few weeks. You know what I mean? No one should be bored the first day. You know what I mean? We all have books, projects, things that we've put off, and now we kind of have to do them. You know what I mean? We're stuck in the house. So that kind of set the premise for all of these quarantine comics, and I thought that people would have like a negative reaction to the art style because they've been used to seeing, this pen and ink, some mistakes, some faces are kind of, some of the older issues. There's kind of like a weird angle I may have drawn it, and now there's this very clean line, and the reception was amazing. And people were just, yeah, this is awesome, and it was surprising. I was grateful for it, and I think it's one of those things that now I'm trying to figure out how I was years ago, trying to find a different way to produce the comic next to the traditional style. And now I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I produce the traditional style next to this new digital style, So that's kind of a brief, rambly, story of how this new side quest, came to be. Did we jump right into the second comic? And the whole idea was that they would each run in a different day segment, and I knew I had started in April. Technically, it would have been time to reopen, if you went with 2 weeks from the March 13th, and it wasn't. So I didn't know when things would start to, I don't think anyone knew when things would start to come back. So the whole idea was, well, I might need to speed their timeline up, but I didn't want to go too quickly, so I'd kind of jump around, and then it kind of became like a thing, like how many days forward would this story take place, or how many days? So the second one plays off the first in that Jarv is now playing his backlog, and he's playing Shaq Fu. And it was a very interesting way for me to bring comics that could never got produced back in like 2018. So I started this sketchbook with one of the old, I still haven't figured out where cameras are apparently, old stickers on there back in 2018. And I started just writing down comic ideas because I was like, I knew I wanted to bring the comic back. So this has been kind of 2 years in the making, in the sense. And I wrote one about Shaq Fu, and doing this quarantine and setting up that, like, oh, they're playing their backlog. It was kind of like a backdoor way into, hey, I wrote this comic 2 years ago, never got to produce it, and now I'm going to say this joke that's been sitting in the sketchbook for 2 years. So it was kind of about the, the writing of Shaq Fu and how, kind of immature and just kind of like off, like just, I don't know, it's weird and just, kind of just like, okay, we're still making jokes like that. Okay. And then day 6 is, the comic is always, there's always a sense of truth to everything, even if it gets escalated a little bit. So what I mean is 90% of the comics have been written because something was said or referenced to. And so I always would say, or when Polly was working on, or Lewis, the real life Polly, was working on the comic, we would always hear that moment and say, that's a comic. That's, you know what I mean? So in the house, me and my wife would be talking and something funny exchange would happen. And then we would be like, oh, that's a comic. So during the first few weeks, you know, everyone's kind of connecting through Zoom and doing all this different stuff and trying to figure out ways to stay connected and stay entertained. And I threw out the idea of like, hey, let's play Dungeons and Dragons. You know what I mean? It's been forever. I have a good buddy I work with. He plays online, or now he's playing online, but he plays, and it's like a different environment nowadays for Dungeons and Dragons. It's a lot more accepted than when we were kids. You know, no one's yelling at, you know, movie stars that they're going to burn in hell because they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. There's no way in the 90s you would ever see like Winona Ryder playing D&D on a show, you know, and now it's like common. I don't know why I referenced Winona Ryder for whatever reason. Now it's very commonplace. It's awesome. And so I kept throwing out, let's play D&D, let's play D&D. And of course, everyone's like, no, what? No, we're not that bored yet. So just that simple, like that's a comic premise of let's play Dungeons and Dragons, you know, kind of noodled in the back of my mind. And even with my friend's Zoom call, we were talking about different things that we could do next week. And I was like, play D&D, you know, and everyone was just shot it down, which is funny because now we're playing Kids on Bikes with my brother and sister, and it'll probably evolve into D&D. So in a way, this comic, you know, spawned, you know, Dungeons and Dragons online with my family, which is awesome. It's got a great punchline being indoor kids, because at the time, this comic was the 8th of April, and the weather was awful in April. We pretty much like winter part 2. You know, the bad guy gets killed and comes back. That's pretty much how Michigan winters are. And so it was brutal. We were pretty much indoor kids for the entirety of April. Also, because of I was creating these comics so quickly and had this backlog of comics I had written for a few years, I started just creating them really quickly. And instead of doing once a week, similarly to numbering them the way I did, of pushing them into the future quicker if I needed to, I kind of produced them faster, and I didn't want to release them once a week. You know what I mean? Because not knowing what was going to happen, you know, it seemed kind of strange to kind of have, you know, day 6, you know, of them 3 weeks in April. So at least to get this going, now I settled down because, you know, life takes over, and you know, I want to get another backlog where I can start producing stuff. And also I want to talk to people who read and be like, hey, if I do multiple comics per week, how would you like those? Would you like which days? You know what I mean? Where in April, I was a scattershot, Mondays, Wednesday, Fridays, you know, I missed a Monday, but here's a Wednesday, Thursday, you know what I mean? So it was kind of, you know, all over the place. So the next comic, this was sort of the realization that like, hey, this is, you know, shelter in place, what's going on, it's affecting everybody. Holidays, like, you know, Easter, I believe, or it was St. Patrick's Day, but Easter was like it's a big family holiday for people. It's big for my wife's family and everything. It was big for Polly, and I wanted to do something special for Easter because most people would be spending Easter, you know, at home instead of with their extended family. And one of the comics that Paul came to me early on when we first started the comic was a story from Easter. And it was the first comic, I believe, where we actually broke the 3rd panel and I didn't know how to tell stories in 3 panels yet. I knew enough. I mean, you could tell a dick and fart joke pretty quick in 3 panels. But when you have like nuance, you know, we weren't good enough yet to tell a story in 3 panels. So I kind of started breaking it up. And then that became kind of a crutch. And then I would use it to be like, well, I want to show facial expressions, which is cool, but it was like kind of like, oh, I can draw Paul's face 3 times instead of, you know, this whole environment, you know. And then as we got better at writing and more concise, we went back to a more traditional 3-panel and we could tell those stories. But Paul wrote this fantastic story. We didn't want to cut anything out of it, so we kept it all in. And the Easter story was one of those like milestones in writing for us of just like, we just really enjoyed it. And so having this 10-year anniversary of that comic falling on the pandemic, the crisis that's going on, and, you know, and having these two characters that who are always, we always wrote them that they were friends, and guys are awful to each other, but we love each other. We don't say it, you know, we do, but we say it with ridicule and making fun of each other. And that's kind of the backbone of the comic for years. And so I think this is the first time they actually really, you know, say anything really nice to each other. I'm sure it's happened before, but this is like a very, you know, nice sentiment between two, you know, good friends. And I don't know, I really like this comic, and I think it's a good companion piece, especially knowing how long the comic's been going on and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a sweet moment, you know, to have this between the guys. And if you can't tell, the game that's in the Easter basket is kind of an illustrator on the fly, real quick rendition of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So in the universe of SideQuest, they have yet to play Zelda Breath of the Wild. So, but if you like this, let me know. If there's a special comic you want me to talk about, let me know. If there's something about webcomics that you want to know, let me know. SideQuestComic.com, that's where you can find everything about the comic. We got our SideQuest comic on Instagram. We got a Facebook page, and now we're jumping into the YouTube.